shall we? Good evening. Welcome, everyone. And welcome to this plush room with oversized clocks and claws for fireplaces. My name is Eric Beerbaum, and I'm the director of the Lily and Edmond Center for Ethics. And it's my great pleasure on our inaugural lecture to introduce Emily McTernan. She's a professor of political philosophy at the Department of Political Science and Public Policy School at University College London. She's an area editor for Ergo and associate editor of Politics, Philosophy, Economics. And her book on taking offense offers a novel analysis of political and moral defense of the neglected and much maligned social emotion. She notes that we've theorized more about causing offense than what it is to take offense. A few of you said you came here to hear defense of offending others, and I can't promise that, although there may be a qualified version of that. And her book, which I heartily recommend to you, includes a wonderful cast of characters, from someone, a stranger in the pub who spills beer on you, a cat caller, and other identities. There's a whole zoology in the book. You'll get to know these characters, and a few of them you might meet here tonight. Professor McTernan has published in top-flight journals, including mine, Philosophy and Public Affairs, and the Journal of Political Philosophy, continues to work on intensely interesting and often neglected emotions and attitudes, from microaggressions, the freedom to heckle, and the ethics of humor. She is co-hosting her department's podcast, UCL Uncovering Politics, which I recommend to you, the moral dimensions, which thinks about the moral dimensions of contemporary politics. So without further ado, I'm going to first tell you a few rules, which is that members of the live audience will be able to ask questions directly, of course. For those of us joining virtually, we will have a system where you can submit questions, and Alex will be taking those questions as well, and we'll mix those in with the live group. For those of you in the room, please wait for the microphone to be passed to you so our online audience can hear you saliently. Now, without further ado, Professor McTernan.
Thanks to the organizers and everyone who made it possible to be here. I'm really looking forward to talking with you all about offense. So the talk's going to be based on my recent book on taking offense that Eric just introduced. And I'm going to be trying to convince you that taking offense is a misunderstood emotion and one that needs and deserves rehabilitating. So let's see how much I manage to convince you over the course of the next 45 minutes. I'm going to start with an example. A professor in science, once an honorary member of my own institution, we'll get to the once, made a joke at the World Conference for science journalists in South Korea. Here's the joke. Let me tell you my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they're in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry. So perhaps unsurprisingly, his joke caused offense and hit social media platforms to widespread condemnation. I suspect that all of you are familiar with the form of what unfolded, even if not with the actual case. So someone says something that offends, the offending remark goes viral, spread on social media, then reported on in the mainstream media, causing offense well beyond its original audience and setting. The usual apologies follow, with the offending party excusing their remark as ill-considered or thoughtless, or declaring it misinterpreted. Often, as in this case, we get reassurances that really they think highly of the group that they've offended. And really, he is a good guy. And others often weigh in to defend the person, reassurances he's a good guy, claims, oh, look, it was only a joke, right? We shouldn't take jokes so seriously as to take offense at them, and I'll get to that a bit in the lecture. And sometimes there are further consequences. So the professor concerned ended up doing a number of apologetic interviews with mainstream media platforms, including the BBC, and he resigned, some say under pressure, the institution insists voluntarily, from his honorary position at UCL. Okay, but I want us to take a closer look at this familiar form of tale. And in particular, I want us to ask, what exactly is it to take offense? What's going on in this exchange of apologies and recriminations? And especially, why is it that the apologies of the offending party so often give more offense? So here's how it'll go. I'm going to start by getting to grips with what taking offense is. So that's the kind of dense philosophical bit. I want us to get a bit straighter on what it is we're talking about when we talk about giving and taking offense. Then I'm going to give us some reasons why, if you take my reconception of taking offense, we should give it a slightly more positive review when we're thinking about whether it's good or bad. And then I'm going to have a little think about the aftermath of giving offense. If you like, a how-to guide for what not to say the next time you give offense. Okay, so let's go. Rethinking offense and affronts to standing. So until recently, taking offense had received reasonably limited philosophical attention. There's a literature on slurs, but it often thinks very little about the affective or the emotive content of what happens when you say a slur and someone reacts. It's much more about when we can kind of get away with slurs, use and mention, these sorts of questions about the use of slurs. What there has been is a large literature on causing offense, and particularly its regulation through the law. So some things might be so offensive the state should step in. So you can't walk around naked, perhaps you can't scream obscenities at a funeral, and I'll include here, although I think that's from a European perspective, hate speech and incitements to violence. But most of the negotiation of our offense taking and offense giving does not happen in the law court, nor should it happen in the law court. Nearly all of it is a social negotiation, where we give and take an offense together. And that's the subject of this lecture. My subject matter is offensive acts like an offensive joke, a microaggression, using outdated terminology, and more widely, the slights and put-downs, the affronts and impolitenesses commonplace in our everyday lives, some big, some small. Now, taking offense has a bad reputation. It's dismissed as a mere matter of hurt feelings. You guys will all have read opinion pieces, perhaps some of the many books that have come out condemning this culture of taking offense in the popular trade press. So it's seen as a kind of mere matter of hurt feelings. It's taken to be a character flaw, a vulnerability, even a generational flaw. So we get the talk of a generation of snowflakes. These millennials and next generation down, they just take offense at everything all the time. There's this new culture of taking offense, people have claimed, where people are ever more inclined to take offense and take it at ever smaller details. Where still, some think that this propensity to take offense is actively harmful to society. In particular, it might have a chilling effect on free speech. There are things that we just won't say anymore, topics we won't be honest about for fear of causing offense or giving offense. But, this is the question of my lecture, does it deserve such a bad reputation? To answer that, we first need to know what it is, this taking offense. So Joel Feinberg provides the dominant philosophical account. On his account, offense is just any disliked state that another causes in me and for which I resent them. And that includes a huge array of disliked states, from disgust to annoyance to irritation to what I would call offense. So it's demonstrated through his really classic examples. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these, of the poor person who gets on a public bus and finds that the people near him are doing all manner of disgusting things. So someone masturbates next to them, someone drags their nails down a slate board, someone eats a really revolting picnic, someone throws up the picnic that they've just eaten. And I think that supports my suggestion that it's all manner of different emotions that you might feel, like these different sorts of things that might happen next to you, let's hope not, on a public bus. But I think there's a distinct way that it feels like to be offended, rather than annoyed or disgusted or a number of other emotions. So suppose that someone bumps into you in the bar, spilling your drink everywhere without apologizing. Suppose that a colleague makes an inappropriate joke at work or an unwelcome sexual advance, puts you down in front of your boss, or constantly misremembers how to pronounce your name. However many times you correct them, they just keep getting it wrong. Suppose that someone pushes past you to grab the last seat on the train, catcalls you on the street, or your partner describes your cooking as just not very good in front of your friends. These, I think, are the paradigmatic sorts of things at which we take offense, in particular. On my account, we're taking offense at a perceived affront to our standing, as we conceive of it. So that can be by someone ignoring or mistaking your standing or dismissing and attacking it. Here I'm departing from the usual way that political philosophers have tended to think about standing. So we political philosophers, I'm going to count myself among them, tend to think of it as akin to a static constant rank that someone holds across their life. So X, given all of their features, social identities, social positions, roles, is higher than Y on the social hierarchy, with the idea that we could do a kind of ranked ordering for everyone in this room. There it is, stuck, static, in place. Instead, when thinking about offense, by a person's perception of her own standing, I have in mind something closer to Irving Goffman's notion of face that's been taken up in the sociological and linguistic literature, particularly on politeness and impoliteness. So what's that? The image or persona that we present to others that's constructed in and through our interactions with each other. So this is a changing notion. It's a dynamic notion in that how we present ourselves varies. I'm going to present a different image of myself here, professional philosopher, than I might at the school gate, than I might in the bar. I'll make different bits of me salient. I'm trying to be read in a certain way here that is different to the way I'll be trying to be read there. And crucially, this standing is up for negotiation. I present myself in a certain way, and then it does or doesn't get uptake from a more or less receptive and acquiescent audience. So you're a particularly accepting and acquiescent audience, right? None of you have sought to check that I really am the person who's meant to be standing here and not just some random person who's roamed off the street. None of you have interrupted me. In all sorts of ways, you're signaling the acceptance of the persona, the image of myself that I'm trying to put across right now. And it's also a more encompassing notion than the one that political philosophers are usually talking about when I talk about standing. What do I mean by that? Well, I think that your self-presentation can involve various attachments that you have, like moral commitments, career, or religion, if you take those to be valuable and socially important attributes of yourself. So if I attack, dismiss, or fail to recognize some aspect of yourself you take to have value, that can be a threat to the way you want to present yourself. And I think that's what explains why we can take such profound offense at affronts to religion, country, and moral commitments. So, for instance, if someone defaces your holy book, or I think here of the satirical musical about the Mormons, the Book of Mormon that caused a lot of offense, or someone burning an American flag, or there was a case at one of the institutions I've been at where the students had put aside to have a party at the death of Margaret Thatcher. And some people found this quite offensive because it offended against their moral commitment to treat death is a serious matter, a sad matter, no matter the person who died. So there's all these sorts of cases where I think we can make sense of that by thinking that people are attached to those things, that an affront to them is given by an affront to the commitment that they have, particularly if it's degrading or mocking. I think that's key here. Okay, of course, what face we present and whether and how easily that gets uptake from our audiences and what forms of resistance we face depends very much on our social identity and our social positions. So I'm not going to have much luck presenting myself as the President of the United States. There's no willing audience there. But I'm going to have more luck than some others. I'm going to find it easier than some others to get uptake as an academic, given my class and race, because of the prejudices that we have. But all the same, I want to insist, much of the time in our daily interactions, we expect our standing, in this sense, the ways we present ourselves, to be respected and recognized in our interactions. We take each other at face value. We don't challenge or seek to undermine the ways in which others present themselves without good reason. And there's a whole set of positive signals, too, of the ways in which we recognize and respect each other. So we abide by the social norms of politeness and civility and what's appropriate that apply around here. For instance, you've come clothed. You're going to sit an appropriate distance to the person that you don't know who's next to you, neither too close, but nor craning away too much, in case that should give offense, thinking, maybe you'll worry you smell, or it's a kind of offensive gesture not to sit too close to someone, but also an offensive gesture to sit too close. And you'll signal that you respect my role as a lecturer here by not speaking until I stop speaking, And here, although not where I come from, use the honorific professor to refer to all academics. So there are some local variances about how we do these gestures. But of course, those gestures don't always happen, and that uptake doesn't always happen. Sometimes we're denied some ordinary gesture of respect and consideration, like when someone pushes past you to get the last seat, that colleague fails to remember or pronounce your name, or someone uses gratuitously offensive language in front of you. Sometimes we're dismissed and taken as lesser than we take ourselves to be. So 2 examples, a friend of mine was trying to sell her own house, and the estate agent would speak only to, or the vendor, I guess, would speak only to her male companion. Another nice example, of course, is Rebecca Solnit's famous case of having her own book explained to her at a party by a man, which is just a wonderful piece. So we don't always get what we want. We don't always have people accept the way we present ourselves. Other times there's much more direct attacks on our standing. So a nice case would be wearing a t-shirt that says on it, "Keep calm, watch lesbians." That might give offense. Waving a banner declaring, "Iron my shirt," at a rally for a female politician. Yes, these are both real cases. Or burning an American flag. And when we don't get the recognition we expect, confronting these slights and put-downs, as well as serious affronts, we can take offense. What does that mean? Well, if you accept all I've said about standing and the kinds of things that cause offense, it means you perceive another to have offered an affront to your standing, as you see it, a threat to the way in which you're presenting yourself in this interaction. As a result, you feel estranged, often and usually only for a moment, from the person who offers the offense. Think of the ways we describe feeling offended. I was taken aback. I was startled that they'd said or done this thing. Or on the harsher end, I was shocked and I recoiled. There's this kind of move to estrangement from the person who causes the offense. And we tend towards acts of withdrawal to convey that we are offended. We pause. And some in the audience have written important work on the meaningfulness of even small pauses in our conversation. Sam there. And we don't laugh at the joke pointedly. We leave a little break in the conversation. We don't offer the next move in the conversation that's expected to happen. We turn away from the person making the inappropriate remark. Crucially, I want to insist, in the vast majority of cases where we take offense, it's small like this. It's the raised eyebrow. It's the pause. It's the not laughing. Studies have even found that's true on some social media platforms. So there's a nice study by Tag et al. On what happens on Facebook when people take offense. Most often what happens? Well, they don't like the post. They don't respond to the post. Occasionally they block the person, but most often we're in the land of small signals, small gestures. That'll become important in a moment. Of course, sometimes our gestures are grander. We can be so offended we break off contact, withdrawing from relations for good. There's one last thing I want to say about the emotion of taking offense, to give you a sense of what it is, before I move on to why it matters against the popular reception and what we should do when we've given offense. So the last thing I want to say about offense is just to point out that it's quite an interesting emotion, partly because it straddles this divide between self-assessment emotions. So those are emotions where it's about how I see myself, pride, guilt, shame, and those emotions that are other condemning, like anger, disgust, contempt. Offense is both. It centrally involves, as psychologists Isabella Hoggy and others have pointed out, essentially involves, and Francesca Derrico, essentially involves in perceiving a nick to the image of yourself and rejecting it. If you thought the other person's portrayal of you as someone not worthy of respect, as someone who does merit that treatment, as the kind of people who are like that, you wouldn't take offense. So it essentially involves perceiving this nick to your image and rejecting it, taking offense at it. So there's my proposal to you. The cluster of perception or belief or judgment, I'm not going to make commitments on the nature of emotions here, it doesn't matter, that there has been an affront to my standing, the feeling of estrangement and a move to withdraw, tendency to withdraw, I don't always do it, makes up the emotion of taking offense. Today, I'm not going to try and convince you that's the single correct conception of offense, although I have tried to do that elsewhere. All I want to do here and now, what suffices for today, is to have picked out a familiar strand of your experience. I hope you can all think of a time that you've experienced an affront to your standing or an impoliteness or a slight at which you've taken offense in my sense. Feeling affronted, challenged in the way that you present yourself by another and reacting to it. So having got through that bit, onto the payoff. What do you get if you see offense this way? If you've looked at offense a bit more closely as its own emotion, rather than muddling it together with a whole cluster of others. Let's return to the popular conception of taking offense and try and rehabilitate offense. So the charges laid against it were that it was a mere matter of hurt feelings and vulnerability, that we face a new culture of people taking ever more offense, and that this threatens to harm society, particularly free speech. So here's my case against that, at least in part. When we take offense, we're not expressing mere hurt feelings. For a start, it's a mistake to see being offended as always hurt or a bad way to feel. In fact, sometimes there's great satisfaction in taking offense, particularly if you think everyone's going to be on your side when you take it, and you think that the person who's offended you is going to have to back down. Taking offense also is involving this realization that you think you've got more standing than the other person has given you. It's a moment of realization that you think you're more than what they take you to be. Sometimes we can even be amused and offended at the same time. The amusement, I think, can be part of our offense. We're amused at the person, particularly when something is somehow simultaneously an egregious instance of the type and a familiar type. So I think that's what's going on in Solnit's wonderful example of having her own book explained to her. It's simultaneously wildly egregious and dramatic and terribly familiar. And that's why it's both funny and offensive at the same time. Okay, so I just don't think it is always a hurt to be offended. Although, of course, offensive things can be hurtful and harmful, given the background context of certain words and phrases and ideas about people that they sometimes draw on. More importantly, taking offense isn't a mere matter of hurt feelings or expression of vulnerability, because when you take it, you're resisting an affront to your standing as you see it. When the women took offense at that science professor's joke, they were offended at their dismissal of their standing as equals, as decent colleagues, as scientists rather than weeping or sexual distractions in the lab. And in taking offense, they're rejecting that negative depiction of women. By not laughing at the joke, by leaving the awkward pause, and by being, as Connie St. Louis, who broke the story on social media, put it, stony-faced, as well as by declaring the speech offensive directly in their words, they resisted and rejected the way in which the professor was depicting women, rather than going along with it. So I think that to take offense is a way of resisting attempted lowerings. By taking offense, we signal to those around our disagreement with being treated or regarded like that. And we signal it to ourselves too. And I think that there's a deterrence effect to the taking of offense here too. So most of us, most of the time, I know there are exceptions, don't like to offend others. It feels unpleasant. It's also socially risky to offend other people. It might make it look like you don't know what you're doing. You don't understand the norms around here. You don't fit in. You don't know how to behave well. It's socially risky to offend people. And so if we signal that we're offended, we cause that realization of the risk to the person who offends, and we deter others from incurring the same risk. And at the very least, you've impaired and interrupted the interaction that was going on between you and the person you've offended, even if only for a moment. Okay, of course, taking offense is not always used well as a social tactic. I'm sure all of you can think of cases where someone has taken offense to defend their inflated sense of their own standing in this setting. And it can be very effective there. But it can also, I want to say, be effective where it's defending your standing as someone worthy of equal respect and consideration. And I think then that kind of resistance and insubordination against social hierarchies in play and in interaction is a good thing. Where one's group faces frequent affronts or challenges to standing, then taking offense is an act of social insubordination, especially where you take it against some common trope or idea about your group. So the women against the science professor, the sexualization of women in the workplace is a common phenomenon. Many, many other cases, familiar prejudices and tropes come out about groups where you take offense, you're resisting that social hierarchy, that particular tiny, tiny aspect of that social hierarchy. So it's a protest of sorts against the ways in which social relations get structured. And so if you take that, then there's something far more active and less passive about offense than the popular reputation has it. You're not expressing vulnerability, you're resisting. So there's the first case against the popular conception. Next bit of the popular conception I want to take on is the idea that it's bad for society, that society is under threat from a culture of taking offense. And to do that, at first, the first move I want to make is say there's something good about the taking of offense and the negotiation of standing that it involves. So first of all, I suspect it's inevitable for status-conscious and status-seeking creatures like us that we're going to care about how others see us. And going against a certain philosophical ideal of what people should be like, I suspect that it's not a generally or widely desirable thing to be entirely unaware of how others regard us. I think it's an important motivation towards moral behavior that we care what others think of us. It causes us not to want to leave them uncomfortable, disgruntled, upset, and so on. And if that's a fair portrayal of most of us, which I want to contend it is, then offense is a very natural and expectable reaction to be having. You care about your standing, you care about how others see you. Next to your self-image have importance to you. Of course, you will take offense. Here's a second piece to the case that there's something good about it for society. I think perhaps if you think that we're status-seeking beings, we often seek that status at others' expense. Right? We want to be higher, and to be higher, that may mean making someone else lower. Offense then becomes a kind of jealous virtue. It's a check on others' moves to claim more status than they should have, than they're entitled to, because it creates a social threat of making those claims and offending others. Making the claim that you're better than someone else by putting them down, it's risky because they might take offense, and that is in itself something that threatens your portrayal of yourself as at ease here, in control of the situation, knowing what it is that you're doing. Third piece of the story, partial defense. And I'm going to get back to the free speech worries, which may be the most pressing for some of you in the audience. But the third thing I want to say is actually to observe something about norms and the relationship between offense and norms. So violation of politeness norms, of what's respectful or appropriate around here, are very often what trigger offense. And taking offense in turn is supporting that system of manners and etiquette and what is acceptable and appropriate that allow us to signal to others that we respect them, that we tolerate them, that we won't seek to intrude upon them. So a number of thinkers have made this suggestion, including Amy Olberding, Cheshire Calhoun, and Sarah Buss has a really nice way of putting it. So she says, look, we can't go around saying, I respect you. I respect you. I mean, we can, logically, but it's terribly awkward. But luckily, we've got this whole system of manners and etiquette that let us do it in this really subtle and great way, so we don't have to walk around seeming quite strange. And so there's all manner of things that involves. So there's handshakes, there's acknowledgement nods, there's the distance we sit from each other, there's the things we won't say around here, there's the things we will say around here, like thank you and please. And those are really important. I think that system lets us live together peaceably and amicably as status-seeking and status-conscious beings that are having to share a society. Goffman-Moss is a really nice example. I'm going to give you this just to make it a bit more vivid, this kind of system that I'm talking about. He gives us a tiny piece of this system that applies in cities, of our civil inattention. So he says in cities of a certain size, above a certain size, what we'll do when we pass a stranger is I'm going to make a brief moment of eye contact and I'm going to look away. So what's going on there? Well, I'm simultaneously giving you a really important bit of acknowledgement and recognition and a reassurance that I intend no intrusion and that I have no ill will. To continue to make that eye contact is threatening. To not give any eye contact or acknowledgement can itself be an offense because it suggests you're beneath my attention, right? Not worthy of attention in a society. That's one of the things that people who are homeless sometimes experience. No one will look at them. It's as if they don't exist anymore. I think it's a really important little gesture. It seems tiny, but out of those tiny gestures is the system is built. Okay, so why have I gone off on that tangent? Well, because offence is often taken to maintain this system. So that's a good thing about offence. And also, it explains why offence is, just as the critics say, often taken at the small things. So it should be. It's part of the maintenance of this system that lets us signal respect and consideration of others or denial. So it's wrong then to think that people are now wrongly taking offence at small details, smaller things than they used to. Offence is very much the thing to take regarding a lack of those or transgression against those small details of respect and consideration. Because those small details are what convey respect and consideration for the most part. Indeed, in general, it's a mistake to think that offence is anything new. So if you think there's a moral panic, so there's a kind of moral panic about offence, those tend to have two parts. They have the part that say this is bad, and they have the part that say this is new, right? And so the newness is also, I think, inaccurate in the case of taking offence. I think offence is a terribly familiar part of relating to others. Given the ways we all seek to protect and sometimes advance our social standing, offence taking and giving is very likely for all of us. Of course, some face far more frequent affronts and slights than others, given the many social hierarchies that mar our societies, that we carry with us into our interactions. There is something new, though. I'm going to concede this to the critics, to the culture of taking offence. Norms about what we ought to do and say are contested, and so offence is taken at things that were not previously considered offensive. Protesters about the culture of taking offence are not worrying about offence taken when drinks are spilled or refusals to shake hands. It's shifting norms over acts like microaggressions, cultural appropriation, pronoun use, and sexual advances that have raised the hackles. Then again, there's nothing new about changes of what's offensive either. So the nicest example I can give to you is I strongly recommend having a look at some mainstream comedy from a few decades ago. It's genuinely startling what seemed okay to say then. These norms change incredibly fast. They're always shifting. They're going to have to shift to make more room for some people than has been given by these norms that have these long inheritances of the social inequalities of our society. They change. So in a way, that's not new either, even though the targets are new. Okay, so I've only offered you a partial rehabilitation, but I've made the case for a more nuanced reading of offence. It isn't mere hurt feelings, it's not some new cultural phenomena, and it isn't of no social use. Taking offence at that joke about women falling in love and crying looks apt and even one of the ways to resist such depictions of women. But what about free speech? What I've said doesn't touch on every aspect of that story, my cautionary tale that I started with, and I don't think everything that happens in that tale is justified. Especially, I'm going to say, when institutions weigh in. So for a moment, let's turn to the broader repercussions of taking offence and the worries about free speech. The worry seems to be that it's going to have a chilling effect. There are things we won't say or talk about anymore for fear of causing offence. Okay, so there's a few things I want to say about that. So I'm going to start with just a clarification. I think one thing that's sometimes going wrong here in popular discussion is a conflation of taking offence and public shaming. I'm not defending public shaming. The way I've characterized offence is very much a thing about our interactions together, the ways we signal disapproval. Now, someone says something offensive, that may be a source, that statement that they've made may be something for which they are publicly shamed. But the people who are doing the public shaming will have a whole set of motivations. Anger, perhaps moral grandstanding, perhaps outrage, perhaps offense. But I don't think there's a special tie here between public shame and offense. I think they're two separate phenomena. And I think very often offense is in the subtle signals in person, the moments of withdrawal and exchangement, the raised eyebrow, the awkward pause, deliberately not laughing. Offense is an ordinary domestic piece of our interactions. I also think just to simply run together offense and public shaming misses out on one piece of what so worries the critics of a taking offense. In particular, that it's limiting our conversations with each other, what we dare say, even between colleagues and friends. Now, I hope for all of you that you don't fear your colleagues and friends are going to publicly shame you. But yet there may be things you won't broach for fear of offending them. And so there is a worry that the offense itself has a chilling impact. The fact that these things have become kind of taboo, off limits, deemed inappropriate, is itself the thing we were meant to be worrying about. Not just that every once in a blue moon you might get publicly shamed. I'm sure, I often offend people. I've not yet been publicly shamed. Perhaps today will be a wonderful opportunity since this is being live streamed. But as yet, I'm in the clear. And I suspect for most of us, we've offended people terribly without any public shaming. So I just don't want us to jump straight there. Okay, so how am I going to defend offense against this worry that it's going to chill free speech? Here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to claim to you that it's ineffective in this sense of stopping people saying stuff. I think it's terribly effective at shaping what we feel we can and can't say without some social sanction. It is a social sanction. That's kind of part of the argument that I've made, right? I want to say there are things we shouldn't do and say that we have shared understandings of and that we all engage in policing. And it's important that there are. Margaret Walker has this nice way of defending the notion that we're surrounded by these norms. She says, I like the roof and walls and the floor that we're kind of living within. They make sense of what's going on. They let us signal respect, also disrespect to others, right? They matter. It's going to be very hard to coordinate ourselves without them. Okay. But of course, they're not static, as I've said, right? They are in flux. And one way we can help move them is by taking offense. Sometimes people take offense to suggest there's a new or adapted norm in play around here and you've transgressed against it. When that comes off, it's a very effective tactic in suggesting the new norm is in play around here. Okay, free speech. I've not helped you if you were worried about free speech and chilling effects, right? I've just said, actually, yes, taking offense is quite an effective social sanction. So what have I got to offer you in defense of offense for this? I think there's been a misconception about what free speech is. So, to have others offended by what you say doesn't infringe on your right to speak. You have no right to a receptive, acquiescent audience. It's not wrapped into free speech rights, that. And to take offense is not to stop a conversation or shut it down. It's a move in the conversation. Now, admittedly, we often express offense more subtly than saying, that's offensive. Clearly a speech act, right? We might raise an eyebrow, not laugh, leave an awkward pause. But all the same, I think resistance to offensive speech by offense and its associated behaviors of withdrawal is all still communicative conduct. To take offense, then, I think is a form of contribution to a conversation. Now, it doesn't resemble the mannerly, wordy interjection into a debate that some appear to have in view when thinking about free speech. But I don't think that makes it any less an intervention into some marketplace of ideas. So I'm siding here with Eve Wagner and Jeremy Waldron in denying that free speech is only preserved where we follow some orderly, controlled framework for discussion, like this lecture. I speak, you ask me questions, I try and defend myself. That's what it looks like. As Waldron puts it, ideas come to life in the rough and tumble of active and even disruptive opposition. And why not include where some take offense to express their disagreement? Now, there is a threat to free speech in stories like the one I began with of the science professor. When institutions and employers weigh in to reinforce norms around what it is and isn't appropriate to say, that does create the kind of social pressure that limits free speech. Social pressure, as J.S. Mill, one of the great defenders of free speech, observes, can itself be a threat to freedom of speech and thought. The risk of losing your job is a very strong form of social pressure. But it's one distinct from disliking what I've said or rejecting it in the way that taking offense at it does. Now, I'm not saying employers are never justified in weighing in. Sometimes they are, but not, I think, where what's said doesn't stand in any direct conflict with the employee's role, and especially where the speech takes place outside of the workforce. So I think we're seeing a slightly worrying creep of what the employer thinks is their job to enforce in terms of codes of conduct on their employees, including over speech. Okay. So my talk, probably, to some of you, will have seemed terribly on one side, perhaps, of this culture war, right? I think offense is quite a good thing. But I've got something to offer the other side now, too. If offense is, in itself, a potent piece of our interactions, a way of resisting and rejecting some affront, institutions like universities oughtn't be seeking to ban or prevent offensive speech simply on the grounds that it offends, other than that is legally prohibited, or unless it interferes with one of the core functions of the university or an employee's capacity to do their work. Now, there's going to be lots of arguments about whether margins are here, right? I agree that that's super vague and it's going to get interpreted in lots of kinds of ways, but still, all the same, to be offended is not in and of itself to be harmed or hurt, although some words do hurt. It's to resist and reject an affront. So the fact that someone has taken offense to what I've said shouldn't be taken to be the end of the discussion or a knockdown objection to the conduct, let alone a reason for third parties to step in with bans. To take offense instead is one move in an ongoing negotiation of how to treat and regard each other. And I think it's a really important renegotiation. So I think if we decatastrophize the taking of offense, we can decatastrophize as well having caused offense to others. Okay, so I've offered this partial rehabilitation of offense. It's not always a good thing, but it does deserve a more nuanced and often more positive appraisal than it commonly receives. Of course, like any emotion though, it can misfire or be directed at the wrong things. So in the very last moments of this talk, I just want to say a little bit about jokes and apologies. I think I've boldly titled it on your handout on how to make them. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to say enough to really say that, but I'm maybe going to say something about how not to make them. So here we go. Let's go back to the science professor. This part of my inquiry comes from two things I find quite puzzling about what happens when people take offense and give offense. So while apologies ordinarily mitigate our negative appraisal of the wrongdoer, act to repair relations, count as at least the start, if not enough, the beginnings of making things right, apologies in the case of causing offense, giving offense, often make things worse. Why is that? And the other puzzle is an apparent tension that I talk more about in the book that I find really strange. So jokes very often offend. Okay, I'm sure you've all heard jokes that have offended you. And yet a really common excuse or mitigation of having offended people is to say something like, oh, I was only joking. Or, oh, it was only a joke. What's going on there? An excuse, of course, that the science professor himself offered. So he said, my remarks were intended as a light-hearted, ironic comment, but had been interpreted deadly seriously by my audience. But that, as in this case, is one of those apologies that often make things much worse. So what's going on? Okay, let me offer some brief remarks then before closing about the aftermath of having given offense. Something I've suggested is very common and so we might all confront. So imagine that this professor had stepped on someone's foot. As I roam past here and I step on your foot and I apologize. Now, unless you think I've been particularly negligent or careless or in some way culpable here, that's done it. That's dissolved the affront, right? Things are fixed now. I didn't intend to step on your foot, I'm sorry. Yet that form of apology for giving offense, it wasn't intended, often fails. And I think that's because unlike the foot stepping, giving offense isn't best understood as a small hurt. If it was, that would work. It's instead to offer an affront, a small but sometimes serious challenge or threat to the way in which someone wants to present themselves in an interaction, to be seen. When someone apologizes that the affront was not intended or meant, the challenge, the threat to standing, often persists. There's been a put down, a slight that signals something about the way that you're perceived, whether or not the person intended that signal. By contrast, the potential threat of standing on your foot is dissolved by the apology. The thought that it might have been on purpose and a kind of act of aggression is gone. Worse. Here's a worse kind of apology you can offer. So I didn't intend it, doesn't work. It's even worse if you say you misinterpreted it, something our scientists did. You're mistaken in seeing comments in this light. You've misunderstood. You've taken it inappropriately, seriously. And I think it's pretty clear why. You've added an insult to insult. You suggested that that person, not only do you think you should be making jokes about them, but also they're terribly oversensitive to jokes. They're not reading the situation right. You just added yet another affront to standing on top of the one you already offered. So two ways that apologies can go wrong then is that they fail to dissolve the threat to standing, and sometimes they worsen it by adding another insult on top. The last thing I want to offer is a thought about the apology only joking. So Salvatore Tardo describes a distinctive feature of humor as being that it permits a kind of decommitment or an ability to retract what you say. Sometimes you can discount your remarks as just being non-serious. And joking as well permits this kind of distance from the belief they imply. So one of the things that goes on in ethics of humor is people say things like, well, do you really have to believe the negative portrayal of the person to get the joke, to make the joke? What can I say about what you believe and the kind of person you really are by the fact that you've made this joke? And there's a huge debate about it. But of course, you're not necessarily committed to the views that your joke expresses, right? Lots of jokes I could make without having those beliefs because they're not serious. They are a form of play. On offending through a joke, as has happened in our cautionary tale, the protagonist often has others chime in their defense. Really, they're a good person. Really, they're quite good with women, actually. You know, they've made that joke, but their true beliefs aren't sexist. And they're distancing then themselves and their beliefs from the statement that they've made, the joke that they've made. So why does the decommitment and the distancing fail for jokes? Why does only joking fail as an excuse for having caused offence? And by fail, I mean it doesn't seem to satisfy the audience to which it's addressed. Two reasons. One is we think it's disingenuous. I think we often don't think that the person is serious about the distance that they're claiming between the joke and the beliefs that seem to underpin it. Having called his remarks light-hearted and non-serious, our professor went on in the same interview to observe, it's terribly important that you can criticize people's ideas without criticizing them. And if they burst into tears, it means that you tend to hold back from getting at the absolute truth. Science is about nothing but getting at the truth, and anything that gets in the way of that diminishes, in my experience, the science. Really nice piece of doubling down there. But you do often get this kind of failure to fully retract going on. But even without the suspicion, the distancing strategy, I think, fails to get to grips with the threat to standing that a joke can present. Indeed, it's not a serious statement of your committed beliefs. And in general, the person offended doesn't mistake it for such. They know it's a joke. In cases like our science professors, no one doubted it. It had the hallmarks of a joke, right? It used exaggeration and overstatement. No one truly believed he thought every single girl falls in love, you fall in them or they cry. It's a classic tactic of a joke to exaggerate in that sense. But that it's a joke doesn't mean it plays no role in shaping our background assumptions or our common ground. And in particular, I think what a joke can do is influence the tone with which we treat something. Really, is it so serious if it can be the subject matter of a joke? So in particular, really is the anti-discriminatory norm about how you should treat that group so serious if I can joke about it? Jokes can also imply background beliefs and assumptions that we, the audience, share. Really, aren't those people a bit like that? Because without those stereotypes and prejudices in our heads, jokes often don't make sense. We need to have that view of the people that the joke is about to understand why that joke might be funny. Even if we don't endorse them, it kind of brings them out. And I think for these social effects, adding information about the individual joker's individual beliefs doesn't do all that much. Connie St. Louis, who broke that story of the science professor's remarks, wrote on how he might have better reacted to the resulting storm. He could have apologized properly. He could, she continued, have talked about the brilliant work carried out by women in science. And she's right. If you understand offense as offering an affront to someone's standing, then one solution when you give offense is to seek to repair the standing of the group that you have offended, and not, and as is what's happening when you make protestations about what a good guy you are and how you don't really believe those things, to try and restore your own standing. On one conception of apology, and I don't think it's the correct one for all kinds of apology, but I do think it's the correct one for this kind of apology, the kind where we apologize for a disrespect, for an offensive remark. Apologizing is a kind of subordination. We lower ourselves. In insulting someone, disrespecting them by offering an affront, you're offering a nick to their self-image, a challenge to how they want to be seen. And the person takes offense. So to apologize, we seek to restore the person's image. To say sorry, I think, can do that if it acknowledges the misstep. Our science professor, given his standing and his platform, needed to do more than reassure others of his own goodness in order to perform the act of repair required. Okay, that brings me to the close of my talk. I've argued that taking offense is a misunderstood emotion that deserves a more nuanced, probably more positive appraisal. It's doing something more interesting in our interpersonal relations than simply expressing hurt feelings or vulnerability. Instead, it's a way of rejecting, even resisting, an affront to standing. And it's a way to shore up and sometimes renegotiate the boundaries of the norms that let us signal our respect and consideration for others. It's also a mistake to think free speech means people have to like what you say. To take offense is just one way of disliking what someone has said and signaling that. But perhaps the central thought I want to leave you with about taking offense is simply that it's far more ordinary and commonplace than the moral panic would have it, if a potent piece of social interactions. We take offense often, and that's no surprise given our desire to be seen a certain way by others, and given the vulnerability of these presentations, these ways in which we want to be seen, to the ways in which others see us. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor McTernan. To test your idea, I respect you. Is that weird? I also respect everyone here, and so I want to open it up to questions. First hand, Zoe.
Sweet, cool. Thanks so much. I love the talk. Oh, right.
Good.
Thanks. I loved the talk. Okay, so I would really like to hear a little bit more about your notion of standing as you're understanding it for these purposes and its relationship to Goffmanian face. Just in light of a certain kind of case that I have in mind, and I'm sure you've thought about, just wasn't in the talk. So I think that I can and sometimes do experience what I think is offense when I hear someone say something degrading about a group of which I am in fact a member, but that is such that I haven't revealed to that person that I'm a member of the relevant group, and I'm not presenting myself as a member of the relevant group in that context. I sort of like hiding in plain sight, as it were. I might even be testing the waters to kind of like see what they think about the group of which I'm secretly a member. And I can get offended if they say something disparaging. So if that really is offense, the reaction that I have there, then it looks like it doesn't sort of essentially or necessarily have something to do with my self-presentation and my uptake as a certain kind of a person in the relevant context. Although maybe that's sort of like a parasitic case on the main phenomenon. Anyway, I'm sure you've thought about it. What do you think about it?
Great. It's a great case. And I think hidden identities are really interesting for this reason, because often people don't quite realize the kind of self you take yourself to be. So one thing I would say is it's still a threat to the way in which you want to see yourself and be regarded, even if it's not something you're making salient in this interaction, because it might be something you want to make salient in another interaction. So sometimes you experience these kind of background offensive threats, and I think this is one of them, where it's not a direct threat in this particular negotiation where you and I are trying to see each other in a certain way. But I think one of the mistakes that philosophers make is they think very much in two-person cases all the time, when actually when I'm trying to make these presentations, they're often to a group or to society, or I'm often playing the same role over and over. And so I think that's how these sorts of cases can get attached to standing in the right kinds of ways. So there's no threat here between you and I, but there is more widely. And whenever we're performing these personas, we very often have a wider thing, right? I'm often replaying the role of professional philosopher. It's often to not just you, but also everyone else witnessing the interaction, some of whom may know that identity, or it may become clear later. And so the threat still stands, although it's not as direct a threat, it's kind of indirect threat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Shira. I'm a senior at the college studying social studies and religion. And I hate when people preface their questions, but I think mine requires a very brief preface, if you don't mind. I'm writing my senior thesis on speech on campus and religious students in particular, and about offense in at least the final chapter. So I'm very glad to come to this talk. I was the one with the misconception that this was a defense of offending people. So very interesting to come and have a complete 180 of what I was thinking about. But you talked about free speech and mentioned that this is a better conversation outside of the law, which I completely agree with. I also don't think that you have a right to a receptive audience in any sense, and that there is a difference between harm and offense. But socially, I think that's really hard, that people at the end of the day just don't want to offend each other and will go to great lengths to not do so. And in my thesis data, I found that 64% of students basically feel that their perspectives, their political perspectives, are constitutional of their own identities. So given that, how do you suggest that we can critique ideas that might be wrapped up in identity without offending the person?
Great question, very important question. I think probably what I'd have to say is that it is inevitable when we touch on certain subjects that are so tightly wound with people's identity that offense will be caused. But of course, there are ways we can mitigate it. So I think degrading statements, mocking statements, they're much less defensible. But I think that there are topics that are very likely to trigger offense reactions, and we're all going to have to come up with a system of dealing with that. So I guess those of us who teach are probably familiar with when we have the more difficult subjects that we want to teach about, the ones that are likely to offend, the ones where people are deeply divided about what they think. There are ways that we can kind of try and lessen the threat that's going to present to certain students. So if you understand offense as partly this matter of threat to standing, then there are ways in which we can enter the classroom with reassurances and with limits as to what the kinds of things are that can be said. Some things are too threatening in the classroom to be uttering. And those that aren't, we're going to all come to it with a shared understanding that we're engaging in this collective discussion together. It's apt to be raising these issues, and we're going to do it in as respectful a way as we can. But there's no way of avoiding offense, I think, on certain topics. Particularly, I think religion is a particularly interesting one, so fascinating thesis topic, and political beliefs are a particularly interesting one. I mean, it's just hard to see how in this country, for instance, you could take the heat out of a debate like abortion. I think whatever you say, you're going to offend some people because of the nature of the debate here. Very different where I come from, right? Doesn't have heat, not the kind of discussion in the classroom I need to do any kind of special work to have. But here I would need to do some special work because of the identity involving nature of the commitments there. So a bit of a rambling response to your question, just mostly that it's a very interesting question. I don't think you can avoid offense, but I think there are ways you can try and lessen the threat and challenge to standing, like mocking, degrading comments that have no place in that discussion.
Arthur.
Thank you. I speak loudly, it's really okay. I hope no one is offended. So marvelous. Thank you. I just love the standing, the bid for standing, the rejection of standing, and I love the Goffman-esque turn. My question, and this is not an empirical question. I'm with you that usually when people take offense, they have good reason to do so, but I want to question this notion of whether you need good reason. So are you proposing a strict liability regime where if I'm offended, I'm offended, and then everything that you say follows? Am I incorrigible about my offense? Or, and of course, I'm skating on thin ice here because what I'm actually doing is I'm explaining my joke when I'm doing this. Is it possible that we can have some distance and look at an interaction and say, well, some people are snowflakes, or some people shouldn't be offended? Now, I can think of some rules of thumb, which is never punch down, right? So we who have high status ought to be extra careful about other people standing. It seems that when the bid for standing is a standing of basic humanity, treat me as a free and equal person, as opposed to treating me in some special way that I want to be treated. But so I can think of rules of thumb that seem to lean towards a strict liability regime, but I can't quite get there because I think people can be mistaken about being offended. And of course, I'm totally with you that these are complicated negotiations about social convention. So you might therefore say, well, there is no right or wrong here. But you're not taking an anthropological view about this. You're a philosopher and you're actually taking a stand here. So even within the context of this being quite socially constructed and contestable, and a lot of these things are bids to change the norm, sometimes bids to change the norm are mistaken bids because the norms over certain things are just fine. So I just wonder what you think about that.
Great. So I definitely agree that you can be wrong in taking offense in a number of ways. So you can just have misheard someone and think they've offered an affront when they haven't. You can think that you've been affronted as an equal, you've not been treated with respect, when you're trying to claim an overinflated conception of what's actually required. And in the book, I offer a couple of guidelines for when that might happen. So I think if it's uniquely burdensome way of requiring others to treat you, then it's very unlikely you can sell that one as a good set of norms we can all adopt and manage. So if you've got a very quirky conception of how you ought to be treated, you can probably only expect that of people who know you. Can't expect them to realize. So in the UK, I can't be expected to know that this random professor is one of those professors who really does want to be called Professor so-and-so by a colleague when the norm is to use first names in Britain. But here it might be a bit different, right? I'm not quite sure what the norms are here. It seems much more formal, and so I might err for professor more often, right? And I might be expected to do that. It's not uniquely burdensome. And there are some things we can ask of others that require them to lower themselves. That's much less likely to be a reasonable request. So there's lots of boundaries, is what we can say. The other thing to say, the one thing I do want to insist on the social construction things, I don't think there's one right set of norms. I think it's going to vary. Different societies may come to different settled judgments. We can negotiate the edges of these, they need revising, but you can be wrong by trying to import your own set of norms, kind of insensitive to the ways in which we're doing things around here. So I think I have got some boundaries. So you can be wrong in taking offense. The last thing I'll say is I think you need to, I think of it as rather in a kind of virtue ethics kind of term. So it's not the case that we can easily have access to our immediate offense reactions, but we can over time come to cultivate our offense reactions so that they track what is in fact disrespecting you as a free and equal person and what is not. So it's going to be a project on yourself. I don't think we have the immediacy of the control to be able to change it immediately. But we do have a duty to work on cultivating the right kinds of offense reactions at the right kind of things.
We got a sea of questions, but I want to go to one online. Sure. Great.
Thank you. So we have a question from the online audience asking, please say more about the ways in which offensive remarks reflect broader shared attitudes. Thinking of microaggressions and Marilyn Frye's image of the birdcage. No one remark is oppressive, but the pattern is. What about when an instance of offense is one bar in an oppressive cage?
Great. Yes, absolutely. So I think very often offensive remarks concern, as you like, the bars, right? The ways in which this group commonly gets downgraded as compared to other groups. So in the book, I hate that kind of answer in talks, but I have a chapter trying to analyze the different ways in which those bars look. So in the book, I suggest there's kind of 5 sets, and they're commonly what causes offense. So not being treated with a common token of respect and consideration. Your group, people like you, don't get that respect and consideration. So there's some wonderful work in disability rights about the ways in which we treat people with disabilities in various offensive ways, that are kind of failures to treat them with the same regard and consideration we would treat someone who didn't have that disability. There's epistemic injustices, which is something philosophers are very common with. I don't treat you as someone who has epistemic standing or valued attributes because of other facets of your identity. There's intrusions and interruptions. That's a really important category of these bars, as you put it, where the offensive remarks are reflecting a kind of generally shared attitude that your group doesn't get the same kind of protections against intrusions that other groups get. So people touching Black women's hair, the way that people touch pregnant women's bellies, There's all sorts of cases like this where it's a kind of failure to respect usual intrusion norms, and so on and so forth. So there's lots and lots to say about that, but absolutely. And I think often, to be offensive, I'm going to violate some norm of how you ought to be treated and regarded, so that you know I'm trying to be offensive and put you down. So it makes sense that they would group around these common and familiar tropes about how people like you are put down. And of course, that varies across groups. So which kinds of versions of these put downs you get will depend on which groups you're a member of. Not all groups get treated in exactly the same way. Yeah, hopefully that helps a bit, but thank you for that.
Lena.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I was thinking about maybe a way in which taking offense could be an exertion of social power, or to be able to control how you're being perceived as implying a form of social power to begin with. And I don't think it's super intuitive. The case of the scientist professor fits nicely into that concern. But I was thinking of cases, the most egregious of which being the death of or murder of Emmett Till, being a case in which the construction of norms of politeness or professionality have been employed to oppress or marginalize or disenfranchise a group of people. And maybe on that picture, taking offense implies being a part of the class with social power.
Great, really important question. So absolutely, social norms are sometimes profoundly oppressive. And that is a really good case of one of the ways in which they can be profoundly and violently oppressive. However, we can't do without any social norms. Obviously, we need much, much better and less unjust social norms. And that's still true now, right? There are lots and lots of very unjust social norms. The thought about social power is a really interesting one. So it's an excellent point to make. Now, it's certainly true that if you are very powerful, it's very easy for you to signal offense and get uptake for it. So the raised eyebrow of the very eminent professor is going to do a lot of work in this setting. Whereas the student might need to signal their offense more virulently to get the same kind of uptake that they are offended. The only thing I want to resist is the thought that if you're not at the top of the pecking order, you have no power. Because I think, because of the nature of our self-representations, the fragility of the ways that we present each other, the vulnerability to nix to your self-image, it gives everyone a bit of power to take offense and have it be effective. That's not to say we have equal power, and it's not to say the norms are always just. So it's a very important example. But I do think that precisely because of the vulnerability in interactions, precisely because of the ways in which in a very particular interaction, you can gain some power even if you're not at the top of the pecking order, like it's your space, like other people around are likely to agree with you, and so on and so forth. It can become possible to take offense even when you're someone who lacks social power. That's one thing I find so frustrating about the anti-taking offense people. Is they're trying to form it into this kind of like, oh, it's just vulnerability, mere feelings. We often see this kind of move with emotions that could be quite powerful for groups that don't have social power. And I think we're seeing a similar kind of move precisely because we all have this vulnerability in the way we present ourselves. Thank you. It's a very important question.
You go, yeah, and then go there, up front. Stop.
Thank you very much for the great lecture. I want to go back to the status-seeking creatures bit. It was interesting to me, and then sort of later on you listed microaggressions, cultural appropriation, sexual advances and pronoun use and all that. So it seems to me that, or at least there's this conception that a lot of offense is being taken by people on the left. And then a phenomenon that happens in parallel that's more interesting than that is that the critique envisioned and sort of fired by these forces is becoming increasingly anti-system, in the sense that the entire workings of the system are criticized, the core tenets of it are being attacked, unraveled, and in essence a replacement is offered or is searched for. So my question is, why should people who criticize a system to such an extent and so comprehensively care about the social standing in the system they criticize, given that I assume they are fully aware of how social hierarchies are constructed? Why should they care? Isn't it rather strange or hypocritical to be aware or seek to advance their social standing while criticizing the system which created that hierarchy to begin with.
Okay, so I think the first thing to say is that everyone takes offense. So I definitely don't think it's more common on the left. And when I gave that list, that was the examples of the kinds of things that might appear new targets of offense. But everyone takes offense. Certainly, on the right, it seems like Trump takes a lot of offense, right? If we're going to take someone from the right. So I definitely don't think it's a kind of left phenomenon. As to one's rights to take offense, this is your question, your right to take offense when you're challenging something like the basic grounding of your society, is that the claim?
Not the right, necessarily the need to.
The need to.
Why should you care?
Oh, well, I think for all of us, it's upsetting to have your self-image, particularly if it's your image of yourself as someone's equal, rejected by that person. It's also often threatening. So the thing that happens, those birdcage bars that we were just talking about, sometimes they're enacted in the very small details of interactions. And then there's a dark side. Sometimes they're enacted in violence. And so I think that it's very natural for all of us to care about what the other members of our society think of us, because if we're not treated and regarded as equals, it's threatening. So there's a threat of violence and so on and so forth. So it'd be very odd for someone not to care. Occasionally you get people who don't care, but I think it's rare. So I see no reason. It's very, very common for us to change and adapt our norms. All societies do it for all manner of reasons. And it's not a threat to the stability of the system to tweak them. We're constantly tweaking them. They'll need updating all the time. Technologies change, who's in a society changes, what works changes. We shouldn't fear the change. It would be very strange if we were still stuck with, 16th century norms. So I'm not worried about the change, and I don't think the desire to change and tweak norms is a threat to society in the sense that perhaps your question suggests it can be.
Hi. I just want to say thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. It was very excellent. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts or perspective on cancel culture, especially on social media platforms such as X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, whatnot. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. So here I'll have to acknowledge my kind of technological suspicions, which may have been demonstrated by the fact that I don't have a PowerPoint. So I very much think that we should prioritize kind of in-person contact, that a lot of the important work of coming together as a society and fixing these huge problems that we have to be done in person. The internet is a pretty poor space often for those kinds of debates. Twitter or X, whatever we want to call it. Social media platforms are the kind, unlike the study I quoted, where it doesn't look like a form of community. So I suspect that the reason that Facebook, do you remember I said it often is in likes or failures to reply? I suspect the reason for that is Facebook, at least as its start, or Meta as it's now called, was about these connections. They're kind of friends of friends or friends of your parents or something like that. And so it's a bit more like our interpersonal reactions, where we're in this relationship. There are some reasons to want to continue the relationship. Don't go too hard or you're going to break it. And I think that online, a lot of the wheels come off, right? So a lot of the kind of training wheels, the things that are keeping us from going overboard, disappear. They're strangers. I don't know them. We're not in an ongoing relationship. There's also reason to signal your offense harder. So it's not necessarily disproportionate to go strong on platforms like X. Because if I'm very near and close to you, if it's my partner, a mere raised eyebrow or awkward pause is going to be more than sufficient to signal my offense. If you're a stranger on the internet and I want to signal that there's a withdrawal or estrangement in our relation, I can't just raise an eyebrow. I'm going to have to do something much more dramatic to cause a rupture. So I think that in some ways it's proportionate to be grander on the internet, but there are lots of reasons why our behavior on the internet is dreadful that will apply also to the phenomenon of taking offense, just as it applies to disinformation spreading, to calls for violence, to all the other negative things that happen in our online worlds. A partial response, perhaps, but that's... So cancel culture on social media platforms. Social media platforms worry me. I can't see much good in them. And it's not clear to me So I've got lots of worries about it. Cancel culture is just one of the many worries that I think we should be having about online platforms.
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question about something that I think that I often feel, which is offense on another's behalf. It seems that, in your account, building off of the hidden identities question, that perhaps if I think someone doesn't offend me, but offends another and is disposed to be offensive, I might, or disposed to undermine others' status, I might fear for my own status with this person's and therefore get offended. But I'm also hoping that and believe that there's something more disinterested we could have, a kind of disinterested offense on another's behalf. I'm wondering how you think of that.
Great. So the way I had thought about it, but I really liked your question because it's made me add a nuance to it. So here's how I had thought about it. Hume has got this case of someone taking pride in a fish in the sea that has nothing to do with them. And it's just an obvious wrong, right? Like, you've got it wrong. You can't be proud of something that has nothing to do with you. And I think I want to say something similar about offense, which makes sense because it's about the image we have of ourselves and how we appraise it. I want to say if you take offense and it's nothing to do with you, you've gone wrong, just like the person proud of the fish in the sea. However, there's lots of ways in which you can be sufficiently connected that offense makes sense. So if someone says something offensive about my child, I'm going to be offended. So we can be near enough, just like I can be proud of my child. So I think it functions neatly quite a lot like pride in where the boundaries are. Now, your question is, can't I, though, take offense on someone else's behalf? And I think what I wanted to say is, no, if they're not connected to you in the right kinds of ways. Partner, child, someone like you, take offense, otherwise maybe not. But now you've offered me a much nicer example, which is that, in fact, it can be an affront to my own standing because I can fear that I'll be judged, that there's a kind of vulnerability introduced. So maybe offense does make more sense, this kind of third-party offense, than I'd assumed it did. So that's really helpful. Thank you so much. Because lots of people have wondered, but isn't it kind of offensive? One way it can be kind of offensive, I think, is that the offensive person can be violated some shared norm that we think is quite important. Like, you just don't say things about that, about people. Like, that's just not appropriate around here. And then you can see why some kind of offense makes sense. You've offended my moral standard, our shared norm. But yes, so that's super helpful. But I think you're right as well, though, to think that generally what we want is a more impartial emotion. So something like anger might be appropriate for the third parties rather than offense. Offense is very much where it has to do with you. But thank you, that's super interesting. And I like the fear for my own standing, because I think that probably is what's going on at least some of the time.
Salim?
Yeah, exactly on this point. This idea that offense has to do with you doesn't seem quite right to me. I mean, when you told that joke in the beginning, I was offended, and now I'm getting worried that you're conflating being offended and being insulted, and being insulted is more directly like about you. And so maybe it's also just an invitation to say more about on your view, what would be the difference between being insulted and being offended?
Great, that's super helpful. So I think that often offense. So if you're offended by the joke, so I think there is a way in which we can be offended by transgressions of our norms. We don't say that kind of thing. You can be offended because you think people shouldn't say that kind of thing around you. So there's lots of ways in which you can take this kind of vicarious offense at the remark about women. So that is all sensible things to take. What's the difference between being offended and insulted? They're very close. So if you're insulted, you're very often offended. But it's not the only thing you're offended at is an insult. Does that help? There are lots of other things that are offensive that are not insults. But of course, if you're insulted, then being offended is very plausible because it's an affront to your social standing.
Or maybe another way, when I feel insulted, I could give your same characterization. It's an affront to my standing. So I'd like a difference in terms of like how it feels from the inside of both.
I see.
As opposed to a difference in the type of objects that elicit that feeling.
Oh, fine. So here's a difference. So some insults that are not centrally about your standing, you're going to feel anger about. So I think insults can be much more direct kinds of threats. Anger triggering effects, approach triggering rather than withdrawal triggering.
The feeling of being insulted by something.
So I think some insults cause offense. those that have to pertain centrally to standing and cause a kind of withdrawal. Some insults lead much more naturally to anger because they're going to, so the kind of insult where I'm likely to punch you or slap you in response. So I think it can feel different. I'm sensing this is not satisfying you as a response.
Well, there's the object, the insult, and then there's the response.
Yes.
Being insulted. And you're giving cases where
So I think being insulted can separate into two things. So I think being insulted can either be, if you like, anger-tinged insult or offense-tinged insult. So I'm insulted and so I withdraw from you, or I'm insulted so I punch you. So there's a kind of approach-withdrawal difference going on there, probably determined by the nature of the
and
insult.
that other one you make very close. Okay, so, yeah.
Yeah, and the other one is very, very close, of course, yeah.
And but then I still feel like something's offensive when it's fitting to be offended by it. Something's insulting when it's fitting to be insulted by it. The insulting and the offensive are not the same. I think there's a difference between them, you know. But it looks like you're kind of.
Well, so it's interesting. I don't know what I think insulted is. I wonder if I don't think it's an emotion in the way that I think offense is. I think insult might be more of a feeling or something like that, a kind of first rush that then gets translated into a broader emotion, maybe. So maybe that's where we're diverging. But I'm not terribly worried. So if you turn to me and you say, what you're calling offense is being insulted, I'm okay with that. We can all play with these words.
Now I'm just intrigued about the difference between them.
I'm going to have to think more about it. It is interesting.
If insulted, it probably wouldn't matter for your project, but now I'm just intrigued by that. Sort of
No, actually, I think it is genuinely interesting. And what I was thinking in my head as I was answering you is actually it'd be quite interesting to pull apart the kinds of insults that push us to approach and the kinds that push us to withdraw. Because I suspect you'd find something interesting there about the nature of the affronts to the person. So I am going to think more about it because it does seem to be quite a big difference between the kinds of insult that motivate me towards a kind of violent attack and the kind that motivate me to just not want to be around you or to cause a small rupture in our relations. So I'm definitely going to think more about that because I suspect there's something interesting there.
I observe that you've offended Salim. I have a reaction. I'm still not sure why he can't have vicarious offense because of what you did to Salim. If that's not allowed in this, then what is the appropriate emotional reaction when I observe your offensive behavior to Salim?
So you absolutely can take offense because you know each other, I assume. You're connected. It's not like the fish in the sea. I mean, you guys know each other, I think. You're colleagues.
Yes, but I don't think that's necessary. But I see you insult a stranger. I see you offend a stranger. And I ought to have an appropriate, a fitting reaction. What's the name of that fitting reaction?
It'll depend on the case. So if it's something like they violated a norm that you think applies to, say, how we treat dead bodies or respect or consideration, and it's your norms, yes, of course you're offended. Someone's transgressed your norms. If it's something like someone's made some kind of insider rude remark that is offensive only if you understand the details of that person, but you can see they're offended by it, right? I make some snide remark that only hurts you, not a general thing about your group or a general violation of politeness norms or something like this, then I'm not going to feel offended seeing that you are offended. So I think we do need that story of connection to something about you to feel the offense reaction. Though, of course, seeing someone has offended someone may trigger other reactions depending on the nature of the offense.
Itzel.
But it's an interesting question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I was going to ask if you thought that we could be wrong about taking offense, but now I'm going to ask if you think we can be wrong about not taking offense. If somebody is, their standing is affronted or attacked, I forget how you put it, and other people point out, hey, that was messed up. Are you offended? And they're like, no, it's fine. Is there something morally wrong that's going on there? It seems to me like, there's a case to be said that the person maybe has really low self-esteem or something like that, but I'm not sure that translates to something morally, valuable or weighty. And then if you do think that there's something morally wrong there, and given that, and I agree with you that our social position can determine the severity and frequency of our standing being attacked, is there a sense in which people who are, like racial minorities or in these intersectional positions where they're, women and minorities or trans and minorities, whether, there's like a sense in which we can say these people should be offended more often, or it's like good for them to be offended often?
Great question. So I want to say two things. So one is, I think, and I only try and defend offence as one of the many possible social tactics you can use. So there's never going to be an obligation to take offence. It's just one among many ways in which you can react and resist. I think it's quite a nice one because I think that it doesn't present as much of a threat to you to take offence as some of the other reactions do, because it can be so subtly signalled predominantly to the people around you rather than the offensive party, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean you have to take it. It's just an option amongst the social tactics. The other thing to say is whether you think there's a moral duty to take offence, this thought you were having about self-respect, some people think you have a duty to kind of maintain your own respect or to maintain your self-respect. I don't. If you did, then you might think there was a duty to take offence. I don't think you have those kinds of self-regarding duties. So I don't think you have a duty to take offence. Could you have an other regarding duty to take offence? I owe it to members of my group to take offence at things like this. Then I'm going to lapse back to the many social tactics, many opportunities to take offence on behalf of my group if it's a marginalised or vulnerable group. And so it doesn't have to be that you take it here or that you take it. But it's possible that there could be some kinds of duties of resistance, perhaps. But I'm not going to strongly commit on that. But it's a very interesting question. And there are various ways in which you think there could. So if you think there is a duty to maintain your own self-respect, you could get a duty to take offence out for that.
Last question, Adam.
Thanks, Emily. Hey, thanks a lot for that talk. So I was wondering if we could look at a group. It's really at the bottom. So my mother used to work in a hospital in Britain, actually. And she noticed that the cleaning staff, who were mostly immigrant women, were often getting sexually harassed by some of the doctors. And, for sure they were offended, among other things, but, the doctors certainly didn't care about their offense. The HR folks were more likely to laugh at their accents and ignore what they had to say. So it seems like taking offense seriously was doing almost nothing for them, or I think really nothing. And the kind of things that they would have needed to do, I think, to get taken seriously, like have a real noisy, boisterous protest or something like that, would be the kind of thing that would in fact cause offense, probably. People are like, oh, it's a hospital, you're not supposed to be making noise around here. And so it seems to me that for a group really at the bottom, offense is going to do very little for them, and in fact might really work against them, given the kind of tactics they would have to actually use to be taken seriously.
Great. So the easy answer is just that obviously taking offence is not an all-purpose means to solve all social problems. Nothing is, right? These things are really difficult. This is one of the difficult cases. And the other thing to say that is, of course, causing offence is not a reason you can't do the thing. There's only one move in the social negotiation. Clearly, in this case, they had every right to do a noisy protest, even if it caused offence. More particularly, though, you're absolutely right that if you're at the very, very bottom in every sense in this interaction, taking offence is not going to be a very good strategy. It's just that I want to say that often we can end up in settings where even if you're a member of a marginalised group, you have some social power because of the vulnerability of other people's constructions of themselves. Perhaps this is one place where social media has some advantages. So you might have thought that if it were the case that they went on social media, created a campaign and revealed their offence to the world, this terrible thing the doctors are doing, I suspect that would succeed in threatening the doctors' self-presentations and therefore be effective. Even though they've not changed the power and standing of their group, by changing the setting, you can sometimes change the power dynamics that are going on. So I guess the thing I want to resist is the thought that we're all kind of stuck, rather than thinking that in particular kinds of interactions we can have more or less room for manoeuvring. I mean, it might be significant that many of the cases of people taking offence to renegotiate norms or create new norms are college students. So even if they're marginalised in many aspects, they are college students, so they have a kind of power that the immigrant cleaner does not have. And so I think we can sort of be a bit more careful about where the power lies and how it can change across settings. But that's not to dispute the fact that it would have been useless for them to take offence in the hospital ward.
Speaks to the force of this lecture that there are many hands I haven't been able to call upon. I apologize for that. And before we thank Professor Tien and McTernan for this wonderful lecture, I want to first thank the Ethics Center team, including Alex and Meg and Emily for making this possible. And I also want to thank the FAS Civil Discourse Initiative for serving as co-sponsors. So let's thank them now. And I will now spend 20 minutes explaining the lecture. No, I won't do that. But rather, thank you, Presbyterian, for a terrific, I appreciate it so much. Thank you very much. I went there.